what I want to discuss is what does it mean? What is the tragedy and the comedy of being a woman, and not understanding a woman as like not in Beauvoir sense, like there is a woman and her life is tragic and this is how. In the second section, she explains what is it, how the situation is sad for a woman and unfair. And the very being of a woman, what is defined as a woman as something secondary, which makes it tragic. I would rather discuss something that is deeper than that. What is it specifically? Woman type of tragedy. I'll explain. So normally, when it was in philosophical pessimism, when tragic side of existence is discussed, is a man-centered tragedy. It's a tragedy of a man, male. And Schopenhauer is the key person here to discuss, but it's not only him, it's like he's the representative of philosophical pessimism, and it's male-centered pessimism. So the key point would be here, whatever philosophical pessimism is mentioned or depressive realism is mentioned, is the overdeveloped consciousness of a human being, like here in Schopenhauer, that he presupposes that something that differentiates human being, man, precisely from other creatures is overly developed consciousness, and there's something that at the same time make man superior to other creatures like animals or plants, fellow creatures that are irrational according to Schopenhauer, and at the same time he's superior, man is superior through this, but it causes greater suffering. And this is the leitmotif, the main thing discussed in philosophical pessimism, but it's very male-centered, and you can see it especially in Schopenhauer, how it's male-centered. So Schopenhauer would presuppose the hierarchy of beings, was a man on the top of the hierarchy of creatures, animals, and then plants. And what distinguishes man is this overly developed consciousness, like man is a rational being, and therefore he suffers more. Like animal would suffer less because they're associated with, this is his reasoning, not mine, because animals are associated with something that closer to nature, with harmony with nature. Plants are even more in harmony probably with nature. So those are irrational, they suffer less. And man, because of the overly developed consciousness, or because it's a rational being, it suffers more. And at the same time, he's on the top. It makes man the top of the occupied, the top of the hierarchy of living beings, like those considered to suffer less. But at the same time, man is at the same time the most suffering being, so at the bottom of the hierarchy, but at the same time is on the top of hierarchy because precisely of this dialectics of suffering, not dialectics, but couple of suffering and overly developed consciousness. And I like Schopenhauer, and what I like precisely is the idea that existence is tragic existence. But what I don't like, or what is questionable, is this male-centered perspective. Is the male is someone who he presupposes, not only Schopenhauer but also philosophical pessimism. And male is something that implicitly is at the center. So it's a tragedy of the woman won't be mentioned here, or something that may be closer to the animals and therefore more happy creature. But I think, in my personal view, I agree that the life is suffering and the life is tragedy. But what if we will place a woman at the center of this tragedy? What is the precisely specific woman from the female point of view? What is the tragedy of existence that woman represents and embodies? And in my view, it's greater or maybe more genuine tragedy this point than the whole Schopenhauer's male-centered thing. So what is the tragedy of being a woman? And we will have time to think about it and develop it more. What is specifically this woman type of woman-centered, but tragedy that woman embodies? And normally feminism, you have even feminist philosophy, you have this sense of tragedy starting with Simone de Beauvoir, not only, but even philosophical comprehension. You have the sense of tragedy that the existence of a woman is tragic, but it's within the duality normally of man and woman. Like the problem is a man. I think it's disrespectful to woman's tragedy to reduce her tragedy to a man, to like keep it within this duality of man and woman. I think it's more optimistic point of view that there is something wrong in this with man or with the patriarchy, and if we fix it, then everything is going to be great. I think this is escapist in some sense position that reduces tragedy and suffering to a certain cause, and the cause is man, which I agree, you can you can do it. But there are other things deeper than and more irresolvable than, it doesn't limit itself to man. I think it's disrespectful to the suffering that woman embodies to reduce this suffering to a man. And the idea that we have, and the idea that is implicit not to all the feminism, but still to some extent to feminism, is the reduction of the larger tragedy that cannot be resolved. It cannot be reduced to a problem with this duality of man and woman. And this slide, and of course, man and woman associating man with this consciousness or brain, which is not true. The consciousness is not reducible to a brain, but at least I spare you this time from the picture of a penis, which you're welcome. And this is womb. So I'll preserve here sexist maybe differentiation of woman as something that is associated with reproductive womb capacities, and man with this idea of consciousness as a brain. Of course, it's not true, and it's essentialism, but let's stick with it for a while and think maybe if the tragedy of a man is has to do with this, something that represents consciousness, and the tragedy of a woman from this essentialist position has to do with what woman represents, the womb or reproductive capacities. What is this precise tragedy? That this is where this is at the center. And in my view, not only in my view, but the possible thing is that it might be that consciousness, so what Schopenhauer called overdeveloped consciousness, and something that we tend to associate how human being is different from other animals. And if there would be a penis here, it would mean it would be more Freudian perspective. You can still see the tragedy of like overdeveloped sexual instinct it's a bit different story. But anyways, this type of tragedy, which is reduced to overdeveloped consciousness, might be reduction of this tragedy. And there's in Lacan, there is this idea that maybe anxiety or consciousness, and in psychoanalysis as such, that maybe consciousness is something that reduces suffering. At least we're able to feel it. What maybe those who don't have consciousness or developed consciousness or human-like consciousness, how do we know that they suffer less? Maybe they suffer more. And maybe the consciousness is something that reduces the level of suffering, or at least the channels it in a certain way. So the other idea is possible. And from this point of view, this one presupposes the bottom one thing, presupposes more suffering, even if we preserve association of woman with nature and animals. What if animals and woman, or what woman represents within patriarchal perspective, what if it's more suffering? And this is the improved version, the reduction of suffering, a way to deal with suffering. Even the feeling of anxiety and depression. And philosophical pessimism would claim that anxiety and depression are specifically human feelings. And this is how, the joke was monkey being the ruined human as a ruined monkey, because monkey was an anxiety. But what if it's monkey suffers more, and anxiety is something that helps to at least preserve the illusion, to channel the feeling of something that is worse than human suffering. So what is this, if this depression and anxiety that humans are associated with is the not greatest suffering, but way to deal with suffering, or something like that. And normally, not normally, but once I encountered the statement that women are less of a depressive realist than men, meaning they're happier. And I don't think so. We were discussing last time the whole idea of reproduction, the complex of reproduction events that are associated with women giving birth, or other events. They normally tend to be associated with creative powers and with happiness and nurturing life. But we can equally, Sabina Spielrein offers us a perspective where those can be associated with also destruction and suffering and similar negative things. And for example, PMS, we were talking about it. The thing is that if you think that woman is happier than a man, of course you presuppose that the way woman behaves during PMS is abnormal, even though it's nearly half of the cycle. And you associate woman with her in state of happiness. She's supposed to be happy, therefore when she's unhappy and anxious, this is the deviation. This is how you presuppose that man is unhappier or more of a depressive realist. So it's very artificial distinction. And if we come back to Kristeva's thinking that differentiates man linear time and the tragedy that occurs here, she doesn't talk about specific tragedy, but if you think of man-centered tragedy as tragedy of a linear time, it would be motive of Heidegger being towards death, that any project of life doesn't end well because it ends with death. It's with death. It has its limits, and the limits is what defines the direction. But it's not going to end well. The final project of life is failing. It can't be accomplished. It can't be successful. So there is this tragedy of man linear time. And philosophical pessimism that is works with this line, with this linear time as time that is going to fail. There is going somewhere, but ultimately going nowhere, defined by its limit. But there is also other time, the woman cyclical time that is associated with woman, and also with nature, and something that repeats. And I think that, of course, it's not the only time that exists for Kristeva. Is both have to exist, and this is the woman's. So time associated with woman, the cyclical time, is the basic one, and something that allows the linear time to unfold. But what if the tragedy is here? Because it's normally reduced to the linear time, that like, here is the tragedy, but what is the whole thing is the tragedy, and precisely this, the whole ground thing that is tragic and just affords, this is secondary and improved version, the linear time of the more profound moment, unfoldment of a tragedy. We can also say that the whole thing, this linear, this cyclical time is, following Sabina Spielrein, the whole thing is unfoldment of a tragedy. And not only here, the hierarchy of beings is impossible. It's not that man or woman are more unhappy or suffering more than other animals. What is the whole world is suffering? And this is what the cyclical time, this repetition represents. The work of destruction is suffering. What is the world is, if the world is like that? There is no harmony and happiness, as we prefer to think, in a nature or in a woman, or when you coincide with yourself. What if when you coincide with yourself, it's not happiness, it's not harmony, but it's the suffering, and through this you feel the suffering of the world. What if world suffering, and there is nothing that can remedy its suffering. And also we can, if it's perspective centered on women, we can talk about interrelatedness of beings. It's not, with a male-centered perspective, every human being is separated from each other, and this suffering happens inside of them, as separated from each other. From the feminist perspective, it emphasizes more interrelatedness of humans and of creatures in the world. So suffering would be not only world suffering, that each concrete person or each concrete entity would be just a representation of the, and suffering can be all of this general suffering, but also suffering is something that exists not within individual, but in between, in the relation, is embodied, not generated, but embodied in between, within the relation, within the relationship between humans, but also other creatures.